Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MythVision. You have never seen this duo historically on video. Dr. Richard C. Miller, Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald are going to take us into a deep dive on the scholarship in the field and wherever they want to take this. I'm a fly on the wall, as you are, and we will enjoy.
Richard, it's a pleasure to be able to talk with you publicly. I'm so proud. You've really made me proud. I was your professor for your dissertation. It got published and it's getting some traction, and I'm very proud of you. What I would like to do in this conversation with you is to describe for people who are watching the difference between a history of religions approach to comparative mythology and a mimetic approach. And both of them are valid. Both of them have had traction on MythVision. But I think this gets blurred for many people who have watched various podcasts in the past. And in order to begin the discussion, I want to talk about Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces. It's a wonderful psychoanalytic treatment of comparative mythologies, saying that there are archetypes in the mythic pattern that is related to the human experience universally. He's a Jungian psychoanalyst. And so he thinks that the various mythologies of the world can be clustered into trajectories of a tale and have multiple manifestations. Folklorists have criticized that methodology because they say we're less interested in the hero than in the thousand faces. That is, we think that the special variations of these myths are just as important as the monomyth, because the monomyth has to do with psychologizing mythology. But the thousand faces has to do with the sociology and the cultural anthropology of how these myths get then reprocessed. And this happens in biblical scholarship as well. So that you have really mastered with one trajectory a history of religions approach to what you call the translation fable or the empty tomb tradition and so on. My orientation, which has something more to do with the hero with a thousand faces, that you have 1,000 examples almost in your book, fable. My orientation is more like the folklorist, who's interested in the thousand faces, and that is the faces that we find in New Testament writings of various mythological pieces. You can trade on general cultural patterns and trajectories that way. My orientation is more to the comparison of two texts. And the ones that I'm most familiar with and probably most known for are the Homeric epics on the one hand, and early Christian and Jewish stories on the other, that shaped their cultural identities by engaging with the Homeric epics, sometimes sympathetically, to say that, for example, the death of Jesus is similar to the death of Hector. But in other cases, it's agonistic, that's competitive. That is, that Jesus is more compassionate than an Odysseus, for example. And I think the Gospel of Mark and Luke Acts are not intended to be historical. They're intended to be mythi of origins, that is, myths of origins. They're telling stories like Virgil's Aeneid, that's a mythos of the early Roman Empire, and that the reader is not expected to see them as historical, but as culturally engaging. So I'd like to respond to that. Both methodologies are important. Both have been present in MythVision thanks to Derek Lambert. But those are different processes. And at some point, I'd like to say more about what mimesis criticism contributes and why it seems to be so outlawed scholarly discussion.
This is a pleasure to be here. I studied under you, and I've always been honored to be associated with you, and your work's brilliant. It's shaken up the academic community in so many ways, and people are still having difficulty processing what it is that you've contributed, and I think we will for quite some time.
Yeah.
The idea of Jung and Campbell and this idea that there's some sort of archetype in the psychology of the human psyche or something like this. In some ways in the book, I rejected that. But I do think that it's important to understand the psychological, maybe unconscious or subconscious elements for why we create these stories to begin with. What are we up to as a species? And why do we need these stories? Why are they so integral to our existence? Not merely items of pleasure or entertainment, but I argue in the book that these are vital aspects of the human plight, important for our survival and our sense of meaning and this sort of thing. But at the same time, though, I think there's enough going on there that you could describe in terms of the human needs that are going on. I mean, you can even go back to Freud and others, but there's so much that's gone on since then, right?
Right.
That's all sort of water under the bridge at this point. But we can identify, why is it that heroes transcend death, or, the sufferings of this world are somehow able to conquer those or overcome them, or have miraculous births, or this sort of thing. The story arcs tend to be, I think in one part of the book, I'd explore, one scholar had put forward 6 different discrete story arcs that tend to dominate almost all of the different folk tales and larger epic patterns that we see through almost any civilization. So that to me is an interesting topic. But when we get to the Greco-Roman world, we've got something very particular going on there. We've got Hellenism. And that is the deliberate imitation of the Greeks. And mimesis, that's what we mean. And when we talk about Greek, you've taught me this, and I've studied it myself extensively. We're talking about imitation. We're talking about trying to pattern a story or any kind of cultural artifact or particular expression and cultural capital after another, in this case, the Greeks. And so Hellenism, if we want to talk about that happening at all in the New Testament, I think we have to argue that, okay, well, what were they imitating then precisely?
Mm-hmm. Very good.
And so, and if not the most canonized works of the Hellenistic world, then what?
Right, there you go.
And so I think that drives us right into your research. Whatever people want to make of it, this way or that, I think we have to deal with that question. We can't just push it off the table like what has happened in mainstream New Testament studies. It's a kind of negligence. Really, it's borderline criminal in the sense that how is this not the obvious question on the table?
I had a very good friend named Albert Lord, who was the writer of Singer of Tales. And at the time, he was one of the best Homeric scholars in the world. And we became very good friends at Harvard. His orientation, we had a conversation once, and he said, Dennis, and this was before I was interested in the Homeric stuff, but I was interested in him. He was a very good friend and a brilliant man. He said, why is it that in your field, the most important author in the Greek-speaking Roman Empire, Homer, is invisible? And why is it that with all the discussion about rhetoric and composition, mimesis is not involved in the discussion at all? And that really set me on my heels. Actually, I was a bit defensive at first. And then I realized he was right. And I've been trying to rectify that situation over and over. I'm going to change the subject modestly. So if you want to come back to this, you can. But I'm doing another book that's called Synoptic Epistles and Homeric Epics. And it's a collection of my own apocryphal epistles written in the name of the authors of the Gospels, in which they kvetch against each other. They criticize each other and anti-harmonization of the Gospels, if you will. And they really get pretty testy with each other in discussing. But one of the things that I do is I replace the jargon of modern biblical scholarship with the vocabulary that they would have learned in school about how to rewrite. And we've not talked about this before, and it takes a little learning, but I want to just give a little, for our viewers, not for you, a little Greek lesson. One is that they would have called imitation mimesis, and they would have called the model for mimesis a typos, that is a type. That is, and one thinks of a signet ring that gets placed on wax. And so the word typewriter comes from typos. It's the way of writing with type, right? It makes an impression, but the impression is not identical to the signet. So that's the typos. When mimesis is different from a revision of something, which scholars call redaction, they would call it metaphrasis, a rephrasing, a metaphrasis. And the original that they are rephrasing is prototypos, where we get the word a prototype. But one of and also to identify similarities between two texts that put them together in a hermeneutical dance, one might say, those are called the paralleli, where we get the word parallels. So the paralleli are the places where you see similarities between two. But then you have this issue of a difference that is a comparison, often showing one character to be better than another, and that's called a syncresis. And if you think one author hasn't imitated as well as you have, it's called a zealosis, where we get the word zealot. And so throughout my book, I use those terms and not the terms of modern biblical scholarship for the authors to describe what they're doing. In some cases, it's a metaphrasis. That is, it's a redaction. And the source document is called a prototypos. Sometimes, though, it's an imitation of poetry, are imitating typi. That is, the types. So it's very interesting to me to replace phenomena of modern scholarship with ancient terms. Now, terms of the history of religions, you don't need that vocabulary because you're not talking about that one text using another. So this is just for the information of our viewers. I'm really excited about this move of using the categories of the ancients to describe how they review each other, how they viewed each other, and how they rewrote each other.
Yeah, I think it's a correct move. I've even gone as far as to say that it feels like to me the idea of redaction, the rubrics that we're using, the kind of the language that we're mapping to, it feels like this is a contrived effort in the modern time for us to make sense of something. Now that we're at the point where we're understanding the ancient world much better perhaps than any other time in history, yeah, it seems like it makes sense to why not use their thought categories? Why not use their methodologies, their paideia, their way of composing? And when you think about it, you've got, even in the synoptic problem, you've got this idea that if Mark wasn't sufficient, they could have just recopied Mark over and over and just distributed that endlessly.
Right.
Why did they go on and create more? And we have it sequestered off only 4. They were creating a lot more than just 4.
Yeah.
It was a factory, and a lot of it was following the same kind of paratactic patterns, the same kind of syntagmatic sorts of cadence and this sort of thing, and pericopai and the shapes of these stories. Why were they following that pattern? Where did that come from?
And that competition, I would say, is zealosis. It's a rivalry. So it's not just saying, oh, I love this story, I'm just going to retell it. No, I'm going to tell it better, or I'm going to omit it. I mean, that's something else. Before we started talking, we were talking about an example of mimesis where you have both a metaphrasis and a mimesis. In the Q document, or at least if people don't like Q, you can talk about a pre-Markan independent tradition. We have a story of the Great Supper. A man prepares a supper. At the time of when the feast is ready, a slave is sent out to invite those to come to dinner. 3 people are busy with other things and they cannot come. And householder is not only disappointed, but he's angry. And he tells the slave, go out and invite into the feast whomever you find. So this is an inclusion of probably Gentiles or others into the family called the kingdom of God, something like that. Mark knows that story, but he transforms it. Now, I want you to be thinking of the Odyssey when I retell this story. A man plants a vineyard and builds a tower around it, and he puts tenant farmers, vine dressers, in charge. And he's gone for a long time. And the vine dressers abuse the people who are the slaves who are sent to get the produce. And in the end, he says, well, I have a beloved son, and I'm going to send him. Maybe they'll respect him. Well, the vine dressers say, this is the heir. Let's kill him and let's divvy up the remains. And they do so. So then Mark's Jesus says, what will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy those vineyard dressers and give the vineyard to someone else. Now, tell me how that relates to the Odyssey.
Right. I mean, this is the grand story arc of the Odyssey, right? You've got Odysseus on his journey, returning to Ithaca, Penelope's suitors, the whole situation. He's coming back, and yes, he's angry because of how things have been mishandled. These individuals who are trying to, the suitors, who are trying to exploit his absence.
That's exactly right. And in fact, there's a passage in Odyssey book 16 where the suitors talk to each other and plan to kill Telemachus outside the city so that no one's going to give them grief, is imitating. But it's a metaphrasis, that is, it's a redaction of the Q story. So now the feast becomes part of a mimesis. So you have both metaphrasis of a prototypos, and you also have mimesis of a Homeric typos. And this is one reason why gospel textuality is so complex, because we haven't recognized the sophistication of these authors in their using not only earlier gospels, but also Homeric epics. And I find it so frustrating, and I imagine you do too, that this approach to the Gospels is so unwelcome, not only by the Christian church, where I can understand why they would be defensive about the historicity of these stories and so on, but also by our colleagues in the field. And it's a revolution in thinking that is so far simply a skirmish when it really needs to be a war, it seems to me.
Yeah, it feels like basically for lack of trying.
Yeah, a lot of it. Yeah, it's easier to ignore what we do than to engage it.
Right.
And argue against it.
Right. And there's also the politics of all of it, and a whole lot of careers that have next to zero training in classical antiquity, especially these canonical works. And so how else would this have registered in the ancient psyche except for to invoke all of that grand story that was so central to the mindset and culture of that time period in these cities where Christianity was born and raised?
And you and I both have been influenced by Tim Whitmarsh, who has written extensively on Hellenism, your piece, in the Roman Empire, but also on mimesis. And he argues that one of the primary ways that spin-off groups in the Roman Empire identified themselves was through literature in crafting alternatives to the Hellenistic mapping of reality. And so they changed the map for their own social identities. Right. And that has been recognized by many New Testament scholars, but I don't think it's been explored in terms of literary crafting of particular monuments in Hellenism, especially Greek poetry.
Yeah, no, I agree. And Tim Whitmarsh is brilliant in all of that, his contributions. He was on my dissertation committee, as you know, top Cambridge classicist, and he's explored that extensively in the politics of imitation. It's astonishing to me. It's almost like the New Testament is treated as if it were born out of a vacuum in some way, a cultural, literary, textual vacuum.
Or a Jewish background.
A Jewish background, maybe, and that somehow just took over like wildfire the entirety of the Mediterranean world, but it had no predecessors to it, had no analogs, no prior. It drew on none of that cultural world at all. Yeah, right. And so in my view, and this is the wicked tenets and this sort of thing, I don't see how you can read that any other way. I mean, what is it if it's not that? And it feels to me like, I mean, this is my experience having gone through my education, now it's been a few years, but talking to other folks that were educated alongside me, reading Homer was not part of the education until I got to you, until I got into classics departments, until I got into outside of this field. Reading Homer was not on the table for anyone. And so no one talked about it. And so in my view, belies a lack of training, a lack of exposure, a lack of rigor around fully contextualizing these texts within the classical, Mediterranean, Roman, Hellenistic context.
It seems to me that there are two reasons for that, and I'd be interested in whether you think this makes sense. One is, and I know you would agree with this, it jeopardizes lots of careers if all of a sudden you have to change your paradigm so fundamentally. But the second is, Homeric Greek is not Koine Greek. That world of Homer, multiple gods and war and so on, is very different from the New Testament. And so I think that there's an aversion to the difficulties of integrating Homer, its language, its culture into New Testament interpretation.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's an archaic form of Greek, a dialect that it's almost, you have to take a separate class even to learn that kind of Greek. But I think what's lost is just how enduring these works were. They weren't going away.
Right.
This was every bit as popular and famous as ever during the time of the 1st and 2nd century, the Roman era. And so to act like that this is what's going on, right? The New Testament is coming along, Christianity is coming along and eclipsing a lot of that cultural capital, and it's drawing on it at the same time, using it. So it's like Franz Boas said something along the lines of, the old myths were being shattered into pieces and the new myths were being built from the fragments. And this kind of thing. And that's really all we've seen throughout all of human history. This isn't something new. If you're an anthropologist, person of cultural studies, an expert in those fields, this would be kind of the expected pattern.
Exactly. I think that's a good place to end. I think that's a good wrap up. The history of religions is one way of understanding that, mimesis is another. So one has to do with general cultural patterns, the other has to do with literary restructuring. And I hope this is helpful to people that have listened to this conversation. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Dennis.
If you've enjoyed this episode, to subscribe to the YouTube channel, like the video, join YouTube's membership program to become part of MythVision's family. Consider joining our Patreon, where we're going to do monthly Zoom meetings with those who are part of MythVision's family. We can use the support, so if you would do those things, it's greatly appreciated. You can also one-time donation in the description of this video. Also, if you're interested in really educating yourself, we have academic courses in really high quality. Be sure to check out our website, mvp-courses.com.